take off those glasses and apologise to everybody that you frightened. Take off your glasses and apologise to us.
I'll say sorry, but I'm not taking off my glasses.
You're listening to Binnall of America Audio.
Best party ever so far. That's what everyone's been saying, so...
Well, we've got to go, but I suggest you go away and take a good long hard look at yourself.
I have. Everyone has. They love it.
All right, I have one more military/government question to ask you, and that's, it seems like in some countries there's a deference to the U.S., and maybe in the Australian case it would be the U.K. government. Do you see much interaction between the Australian government and the U.S./UK government with regards to the UFOs? You know, like, I've heard of, in some countries, like, we were talking about the South African guest I had on, and he was telling the story about the UFO that crashed, and somehow it ended up getting sent to America. So is there a situation like that in Australia too, or are they pretty independent on UFO stuff?
Largely speaking, it's been sort of maintained within Australia, but there does seem to be some sort of relationship between particularly the American government and the British government, probably more so the British government in earlier times, but because of the prominence of things like Project Blue Book through the United States Air Force, the American program was always deemed to be the official guidebook, so to speak, and one of the more substantial cases, which was literally referred to as the Australian UFO Holy Grail, was a case that occurred in 1953, the so-called Drury film. This was a daylight movie footage taken by a Super 8 camera by the deputy head of the Department of Civil Aviation in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. This is the big island country to the north of Australia, which at that time was a colony or protectorate of the Australian government. And he was filming actually a native fisherman and then saw a very fast-moving rocket-shaped object tearing across the sky, and he filmed this for he thought about 30 seconds up to a minute, and then that film became the subject of a very intense investigation by the military and the intelligence community. I actually spoke to the two ASIO officers. This is our domestic intelligence service. I actually interviewed them decades after, and usually, as you would expect, these intelligence people weren't particularly forthcoming, but they did indicate that they maybe acted in the form of a courier kind of capability, and they actually brought that film back to Melbourne in Australia, and it was subjected to a fairly intensive investigation here. But the story goes that it eventually found its way across to the United States and came under the attention of I think it's called the National Photographic Interpretation Center, which at that time in the 50s was a front for a CIA operation, and it apparently was examined through the same sort of attention that was given to some of the early famous films, such as the Tremonton film and the Great Falls film in the United States. It kind of got that similar attention. But when the film arrived back in Australia, it then became very controversial, simply because by the time the deputy director, it was a fellow called Tom Drury, got the film back, it appeared that the main portions of the film had been deleted, and it became a real kind of celebrated case for the possible cover-up and connections with US authorities, the CIA, and all that kind of stuff here in Australia. And so there was this long-term effort, particularly amongst the civilian community, to track down the missing sections of the Drury footage. And I actually came across prints from the footage in the Air Force files. Very convoluted story, but it goes more towards the argument that it was a real kind of foul-up in this case, maybe rather more so than a cover-up. But it was a clear example of how the domestic operation here, the military operation, deferred to American authorities because they sent the film across there to be examined in more detail.
Yeah.
But it was a very controversial case, that one.
Sounds like it. Now, this last one here on the military government part is kind of a wild one, but I wanted to ask you because I remember hearing in various circles in ufology about a mountain or something that's in Australia that's part of a U.S. base that some people claim is part of an alien base too or something like that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, this is probably part of the apocryphal stories that surround Central Australia. There's a mountain there called Mount Zeal, which is to the west of the rather sensitive Pine Gap facility there. Pine Gap is another one of these so-called joint American and Australian facilities. Pine Gap's the centre of all sorts of apocryphal tales about it being some sort of underground base or whatever, but in terms of the mainstream, Pine Gap is just seen as another one of these major listening facilities that's centred in Central Australia. But Mount Zeal was deemed to be a location that was fingered via claims that emerged from remote viewing exercises that were conducted through the early US Army facilities and that kind of stuff. There's been a lot of attention to this remote viewing campaign that was conducted through the US military, and people were obviously investigating this aspect, but apparently some early attempts to test some of the US Army remote viewers involved remote viewing 4 facilities around the world that were allegedly possibly alien bases, and one of these was Mount Zeal.
Yeah.
And so Mount Zeal has been a bit of a focus, but there's no credible evidence to back that up at this stage. But certainly Pine Gap, which is just to the east of Mount Zeal, has been the subject of a lot of apocryphal UFO stories. I've even had abductees claiming that they've been on board UFOs that are flowing into the underground facility at Pine Gap. So it's certainly the subject of some interesting stories.
Yeah, so it sounds like an Australian Area 51 type situation.
Yeah, but very, very difficult to confirm. And again, I put those all in the category of apocryphal stories. Very interesting tales, but very difficult to substantiate. We have even our own fair share of crashed UFO stories, and none that are quite on the scale of Roswell, but certainly some that are interesting, to say the least.
All right, now to look at the next big pillar, I guess you could say, of influence here on the UFO phenomenon and ufology in Australia, and that's the media. I guess for starters, just talk about, how the media has looked at the UFO phenomenon over the years. How has it changed, if it has changed at all? What's been the evolution of media coverage of UFOs?
Right. Well, probably during the 50s, there was a lot of kind of openness and a lot of serious kind of reporting in many ways, and that serious reporting has turned up from time to time over the decades, particularly in the wake of the Frederick Valenti's disappearance over Bass Strait and the Kaikoura UFO reports out of New Zealand at the end of 1978. This is the case that involved a news crew, a media crew out of a Melbourne TV station here in Australia going across to New Zealand to investigate pilot UFO reports in New Zealand. And while on board, they filmed UFOs, and some of these UFOs were correlated with ground radar events as well. So it was a very spectacular case that got a lot of media interest. And so in the wake of that, there was a lot of serious reporting as well. And from time to time, there's intermittent serious reporting, but the majority of media reporting I would regard as less than compelling, and it's usually filler entertainment kind of fodder and rarely substantial stuff and really based on any serious investigation of the subject. And so media reporting, much like it is in the United States, is more often than not pretty poor in terms of going to the heart of the substantial basis of the UFO phenomenon. It's pretty rare to get good, solid, substantial media reporting.
Yeah.
In fact, to my mind, it's been more of a dumbing down of the subject courtesy of the media. They rarely engage in a substantial way with the substantial nature of it. From time to time, there's the odd exception. Perhaps just in the last year, I was involved with helping set up an evidence room that was attached to an art gallery that was exhibiting what was called the Visitors Exhibition, which is basically Australia's connection to UFOs and aliens, etc. So there's a lot of artworks associated with it, where mainstream artists were doing paintings and various kinds of responses to the alien subject. And so I was engaged to set up an evidence room with that, and it was very substantially responded to. There was a lot of public interest and a fair bit of media reporting to it, and most of that was reasonably objective. And so there is a real ebb and flow that goes on, but it's a very rare event to see any good, coherent reporting from the media.
Yeah, and what about the paranormal media, if you will? You know, like here in America, we have Coast to Coast AM. That's a pretty mainstream program that does cover the paranormal, and there's also a host of paranormal programs on basic cable now here in America, and not including, you know, American imports from, you know, not including stuff that comes from America that gets shown on Australian TV or Australian radio. Is there much in the way of paranormal media?
There is, to a limited extent. A lot of that's internet-based, as you often have in the United States as well. There was, up till recently, a thing called Ghost Radio that focused on a broad cross-section of the UFO, paranormal subjects, that kind of stuff. That came out of Western Australia, but I think that's now in retirement at the moment. But there are a lot of individual kinds of efforts across a diverse range of subjects, including UFOs, cryptozoology or mystery animal type things, ghosts, the paranormal, all that kind of stuff. That's all reasonably well served by a lot of different internet sites that get into these kinds of things. And but in terms of major media outlets, there's very little of that occurring in Australia. There's the odd occasional burst of interest and programming that might get into that kind of thing. We had during the 80s and early 90s a TV program that was quite popular called The Extraordinary, that covered all those kinds of subjects, and UFOs and ghosts and that kind of thing. And that was a very well received kind of program for quite a while, but that too petered out after a few years. These days, it's more of, as I said earlier, a bit of a dumbing down in terms of media interest. When they do engage with the subjects, such as UFOs, they don't do it in a very serious kind of way most of the time. It's a pretty rare thing. There's a new thing coming on the horizon called Hot Zone, coming out of Australia as well, but it's still yet to see the light of day in terms of substantial programming yet. But also too, there's a freelance documentary maker that's making a program based on the West Hall school case that I mentioned in 1966. They're making a documentary devoted to that one single case because of its spectacular nature. So there is some signs of healthy media interest, but it's more the exception than the rule. Yeah,
sounds a little bit like America there.
That's correct.
Yeah, and then I guess the last big Australian UFO puzzle piece that I wanted to fit into the whole equation here, and that's the everyday people, not you and me, and you know, the people that work with you and the people who listen to my show, but the people who don't seem to have any interest really in the UFO phenomenon. What's the general attitude, I guess you could say, of the public in Australia with regards to UFOs?
Well, I think it's a kind of still a strong interest there. I think because of the kind of naive treatment the media gives it from time to time, most people, amongst the general public, tend to report their sightings through to these various internet sites that are a bit of a more of a receptive ear to their experiences. They tend to shy away from mainstream media. In terms of, I guess, more organised indications of the level of interest, public polling, for example. Back in 1988, there was what was called a Solwick opinion poll that found that 42% of Australians believed in UFOs. Now, more recently, in 2005, Reader's Digest did a similar kind of polling, and they were coming up with figures like 84% of believers think aliens will be friendly. 4 out of 5 believe that aliens exist. 67% of the polling indicated that aliens had already visited Earth and all that kind of stuff. So there were some pretty significant figures there, but again, polling is polling, I guess. It's hard to tell how well that correlates out there into the wider community. There seems to be a high level of interest there amongst the community, but it's often driven by media, and of course a lot of the media interest is pretty poor. So
yeah.
it's hard to know. The media interest isn't a good expression of the public interest. Whenever there's some serious documentation going on, there seems to be a high level of interest, and so there are some signs there that it's a subject that's still of great interest to the general public.
Yeah, I'm sure you have your share of skeptics in Australia too, right? Have you had run-ins with your Australian brand skeptics?
Yeah, we have, I guess, the Psychops variant here, the Australian Skeptics group here, and their interest seems to be more of an armchair variety. I've had various engagements with them from time to time, and they seem to have a healthy respect for my involvement, but they don't engage with the subject in a substantial kind of way. It seems to take more of a debunking persona, it can't be, therefore it doesn't exist type approach.
Yeah.
But they do. This is an example of the way the media tends to be fairly superficial about it. They often, if they have something of a UFO nature or paranormal nature, they'll drag out the skeptics, and the skeptics have generally not done much homework when it comes to the particular case or experience involved, but usually write the whole thing off. And so that tends to be their kind of approach.
Yeah, so much like America.
That's kind of typical kind of approach. So as for detailed engagement by skeptics with these respective subjects, it just seems to be fairly superficial most of the time.
Yeah.
I've even said to one of the former presidents of the Australian Skeptic Society that perhaps they should rename their organisation. Rather than being the Australian Skeptic Society, they should call themselves the Australian Debunking Society, but they didn't seem to take too kindly to that. So.
Oh, boy. Now, is there anything else we should touch on here for Australian ufology? I mean, we've already, I know we've done 2 hours, so.
I've probably exhausted you already, so.
Well, no, I'm doing all right. I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss out on any area that you thought deserved coverage here.
Well, I think the fact that we've got a fairly robust and energetic sort of research community that's sort of there and it's documenting the UFO subject. There's large numbers of investigators, etc., of different shades of involvement, that kind of thing, that help document the UFO subject, and we have a pretty healthy kind of interaction with the wider world UFO community. And I think what of more general importance is that this Australian UFO experience attests to the fact that we're dealing with a global UFO experience rather than something that's just an American kind of obsession, perhaps. And a lot of commentators over the decades, particularly in the early decades, like the 50s and 60s, always saw it as an American-generated form of hysteria, perhaps. But the subject's a lot more robust than that, and that's why I've examined the Australian scene in detail. It's clearly another manifestation of the international dimensions of the subject.
Absolutely. That's what we're all about here on the show is bringing out the global dimension to this whole thing. Now, as far as Australian phenomenon go, have you ever had a run-in with a Junjidi?
A Junjidi. Maybe there's a pronunciation problem going on. Lost in translation.
It's like a mini Bigfoot?
Oh, yes, yeah. I know that you spoke earlier to Tony Hillier, a friend of mine as well, and his co-author, Paul Cropper. They put together a couple of good books on it, on the Yowie scene here in Australia, and there's certainly a number of researchers here in Australia that examine that whole Bigfoot Yowie scene here, and there seems to be some pretty impressive evidence for that, and so there is this kind of informal network that operates around Australia, people like me who are familiar with people like Paul Cropper and Tony Healy, etc. When we run across a case like that, we obviously defer to people like Tony and Paul to investigate these sorts of things. Yeah, we each have our areas of specialty, but as for a personal encounter with a Yowie or that kind of thing, no, I haven't had one.
There you go. Yeah, I just wanted to throw out a Yowie reference and put over Tony and Paul's book, which is outstanding, the Yowie book.
Yes.
And now when we were setting up the interview here, you said you wanted to talk about the China-Asia experience, and I don't know exactly what you mean by that. I presume ufology in China and Asia, but let's dig into that a little bit and talk about that, because it sounds like something you've become interested in.
Well, certainly it's become a pretty substantial interest of mine, and particularly in recent years, because I was kind of led to it in many ways through the rather bizarre DNA connections that came out of the Puducherry alien hair investigation. I should preface that by saying I'm not saying categorically that the Curry hair sample is an alien hair sample, but it certainly has some pretty compelling evidence attached to it. So it's one particular example, but through the investigation there, that's led us into examining some of the connections that have emerged from the Asian subcontinent, that kind of thing, and it kind of renewed my interest in the general Asian UFO experience, which has been largely neglected. And the Chinese UFO experience, or certainly from a civilian investigator point of view, didn't really take off until the late 70s, particularly because China was being devastated by things like the Cultural Revolution and all that kind of stuff, and the communist regime and that kind of thing. And but when Chinese ufology finally took off in the late 70s, it took off in a fairly big way, and Western researchers often look with a little degree of envy at the Chinese scene, because it seems to have a fair degree of prominence of scientists and academics amongst the civilian UFO research community, and also they have sort of milestones like a UFO publication that has a circulation of 500,000, that kind of thing. And,
oh, wow.
When you have that kind of spectacular thing by Western standards occurring, it certainly draws attention. And so given those kinds of points of stimulus, I was kind of intrigued by the Chinese UFO scene. I wanted to get really to the bottom of it. And I've been there 3 times now, 2002, 2005 and 2006. And particularly during 2005, I attended a UFO conference at Dalian, which is a northern port city, quite a beautiful city, but it's also the centre of a vibrant UFO research community there as well. And at that conference, the only other Westerner was Stanton Friedman. There was also a researcher from Hungary and an enthusiast from Israel as well. So we were the only kind of representatives there amongst the Chinese Asian research community there, giving our take on the scene. And it was a really interesting experience to somewhat kind of lost in translation to a certain extent, but it allowed me to engage directly and continue stuff that I'd set up in 2002. Engaged directly with a lot of the key UFO researchers in China, and through that I was able to get access to a lot of the key data on some of their substantial abduction cases and UFO cases, and so it's just basically confirmed that there again there's a pretty robust international dimension to the phenomenon, and so it's an ongoing kind of thing, and I'm trying to work at a manuscript on trying to document the whole Chinese scene and also the wider Asian UFO experience as well. Because of the Curie investigation, that led us also into investigating things in Thailand as well, and a couple of other locations there as well.
Now, before I ask the next question, do you know any English-speaking Chinese ufologists? Because I would love to get one on the show. I've been trying to break into the Pacific Rim for a while here, and I can't find any. I was calling over to Japan 2 months ago, and getting all these Japanese-speaking people who didn't know any English. So I'm trying to get in there.
Yeah, that's always a bit of a problem in terms of trying to get a handle of the Chinese scene, because the key person that was associated with the Chinese scene in terms of its disclosure in America, for example, was Paul Dong, who came out with a book in, I think, about 1984, The 4 Mainland Mysteries of China now. So he's English-speaking, but he would be in his, I think, 70s now, I think. So he would be a good person to talk to, but he certainly documented the opening of the civilian investigations, particularly from the late 70s and early 80s. I think his book was actually had a foreword by Dr. Alan Hynek as well.
Oh, wow.
But in addition to that, the other key publications that came out on the Chinese UFO scene actually, unfortunately, I guess fortunately for the French, all came out in France through a Chinese researcher by the name of Shibo. He's written 3 books on the subject, and they all give a fairly substantial undertaking of the subject, but I don't think he speaks English either. And in addition to that, the best known of the civilian researchers out of China would be Sun Shi Li, but he too doesn't speak English, and most of his appearances in the United States have been translated by Spanish speakers, because he was at one point Chairman Mao's Spanish translator. So,
wow.
There's a real lost in translation exercise going on here. Now, I have met a couple of English-speaking Chinese researchers in Beijing and a couple of other places, but how willing they would be and how able they would be to, I guess, articulate the full dimensions of the subject in China, I'm not sure, but it's something I'd take on board and perhaps come back to you on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to task you with that if you don't mind, because I've got a couple other people working on this whole thing of breaking Binnall of America into the China, Japan, Asia area. But it's hard. But we got into South Africa and now Australia, so I'm hoping we can spread this thing around the world and talk to more people around the world.
Yeah, one of the key researchers I was dealing with there used to know English. That Xi Jinping, but fortunately, because he never used English much, his grasp of English elapsed over the decades or so, and so I've had to use interpreters when I sort of talk with him, basically. But he's been one of the key researchers in terms of investigating a lot of the abduction cases in China, and very active researcher, etc. And so he's quite prominent over there. Sun Shi Li is more of a father figure now in terms of Chinese ufology, and has kind of taken a bit of a back seat, but he's still seen as a prominent father figure in the civilian UFO community over there in China.
Yeah. I guess the point of view here in America is that we think that the Chinese government is pretty hostile in general, and tyrannical, I guess is the best word. How does the Chinese government feel about this civilian UFO scene, and how much is run by the Chinese government, do you think?
That's a very difficult thing, something that I tried to get a firm grasp of, because there have been some fairly dramatic military encounters that have emerged out of China as well, particularly during the 80s and 90s, and those cases have come out in a bit of a piecemeal fashion, and it's very difficult to get a degree of official confirmation of some of these things, but some of them have leaked out, particularly through the civilian groups and that kind of thing. It's very hard to articulate the level of involvement in terms of the government's tolerance to the civilian UFO scene. It certainly seems to enjoy a lot more tolerance than our own domestic UFO investigations here in Australia and the United States, for example. There almost seems to be a form of de facto acknowledgement. The civilian UFO group, the main one, Puro, is actually has a part in, I guess, the broader, more general scientific networking that goes on in China. There are various societies like the chemical societies and physics societies and mathematical societies here in the Western world. The Chinese UFO group seems to occupy a similar kind of place, but they realise though, to put it into proper context, that it is a junior player and very much on the outer rather than the inner circle, but it does seem to have that kind of connection. But again, also too, I should point out that there is still a healthy skeptics community in China as well, and as long as the UFO researchers don't digress too much into the mystical religious scene, all is well. But as soon as you start to cross that line into the mystical kind of stuff, it starts to get into the kind of problem areas that occur with things like the Falun Gong organisation. The leader of that organisation made some somewhat bizarre claims about extraterrestrials and UFOs and that kind of stuff, and so as soon as there was that kind of connection, a lot of the civilian researchers learned to be very flexible in the profile that they had, and would perhaps take a low profile while there was sort of a clampdown on things like Falun Gong.
Yeah.
So it is a fairly difficult thing to discern, but recently I've been aware for some time that the official, well, in terms of civilian UFO groups, there was this clear indication that ufology in China emerged in the late 70s in the wake of the Cultural Revolution. What doesn't seem well documented is that there seems to have been a major official investigation that took place in China during the 60s, 70s that has been fairly well hidden, but I'm starting to learn of some of that courtesy of the activities of some business people that apparently had prominent roles. These are overseas business people that had activities in China during the Cultural Revolution period, and they became aware of what appeared to be substantial investigations conducted by scientists and officially sanctioned investigators, and all of this was kept secret during the 60s and the 70s, and that's something I'm trying to work on to get a full handle of. But there were some pretty bizarre stories that emerged. For example, allegedly Chinese investigators, official investigators, investigating an outbreak of a town or a city being besieged by UFOs, to the point where there was the claim that the local key authorities, such as the mayor, were almost possessed by alien intelligences. And the story goes, that was given to me, was that the Chinese authorities had a pretty aggressive and robust approach to resolving this problem of a alien takeover of a town, and that was that they went in and apparently shot the mayor, and the alien infestation problem was ended, allegedly, according to the source that gave that story to me. So it's a pretty bizarre story, but it highlighted that there was some sort of, I guess, fatalistic approach that the Chinese authorities had to the claim that aliens were there. They seemed to, according to the source giving me this story, suggested that the authorities accepted that aliens and UFOs were real, and that they tolerated their presence as long as they didn't interfere too much with Chinese society. And when they did, they would aggressively respond to it. That's a tale yet to be fully told yet, and I hope to be able to document that in a bit more substantial way in perhaps not too distant future.
Nice.
So there does seem to be a lot of hidden dimensions to the UFO experience in China, which is slowly emerging.
Yeah, I hope so, because it's a fascinating area, huge country, huge population. There's got to be so much UFO information there, and like I said, hopefully we can open some doors here and get some English-speaking people on. Even if they've left China, maybe they'd feel safer in that regard.
Well, I think a lot of discussion on UFOs is fairly open in China, as long as it doesn't digress into controversial areas.
Yeah, I just wouldn't want to cause someone to get executed or something like that, so play it safe.
Well, I don't think that's likely to happen, but
they must be watching too much Fox News over here or something. I don't know. Well, Bill, we've talked quite a bit here about all things Australian ufology and a lot of stuff here on China and Asia and ufology. What do you have up your sleeve? What do you have coming down the pike? What are your plans for the future? Short-term, long-term, what can we expect from Bill Chalker? Obviously, you got the 2 books out already, The Oz Files and Hair of the Alien. Sounds like you're working on all kinds of other stuff. Share with us what we can expect from Bill Chalker in the future.
Well, I'm certainly sort of researching in a very deep way the whole Asian UFO experiences, as we've just addressed, but I'm also interested in documenting, I guess, the history of the engagement of science with the UFO subject, and a lot of that is a very sorry kind of history, and but I also want to try and document that in a lot more detail, particularly perhaps to two audiences, both the general audience but also the scientific community, in terms of highlighting the fact that there has been from time to time substantial engagements by members of the scientific community, but usually in isolation. And when you ask science and UFOs, the question of most scientists, all they generally know about is things like the Condon Committee report, and yet few of them have actually even read it. And those that have, more often than not, have a completely different response. It's not generally known that, for example, the Japan group out of France came into being mainly through the activities of Dr. Claude BOAA, who read the Condon report shortly after it came out. And contrary to the conclusions of the Condon Committee, he read the Condon report in detail, front cover to back cover, and came away thinking that there was a bona fide UFO problem that had to be looked at. And so he got engaged with it and was instrumental in getting Japan, the official French organisation, up and running in the 70s as a consequence of it. So I think there's an important story to be told there about the scientific potential of the UFO subject, and that's something I'm working strongly on at the moment as well, and also trying to document the broader history of the UFO subject in Australia as well.
Nice. Sounds good. Any coming back to America anytime soon? Speaking engagements or anything like that?
No invitations out there at the moment, but certainly would like to, because as you probably appreciated today, that there's a big story to be told there that isn't that well known in terms of, I guess, the American audience.
Absolutely. We're trying to bring the American audience up to speed here on the global UFO phenomenon, and as we bring more guests on, like you and Christo Lowe and Gildas Bordes, people are starting to understand just how deep and rich the UFO history is all around the world.
One thing in particular I thought was really interesting was that one of the things I've been pushing in the wake of the Hair of the Alien book, for example, and the focus on this DNA forensic focus, is that I was really pushing that hard in terms of having a more scientific forensic approach to these sorts of cases, and I find it interesting that, for example, organisations like MUFON are particularly getting into that and starting to promote the forensic type of approach to UFO investigations. So I think that's great that that's starting to occur, and it certainly gratifies me because I've been sort of pushing that approach, particularly in the wake of this investigation of the Peter Curry case.
Absolutely, definitely. Well, like I said, Bill, I can't thank you enough here for coming on the show. We started out slotted at an hour. We've gone 2.5, and I have a feeling that if I wasn't worried about my phone bill and all kinds of, and it wasn't running up to midnight here in Boston, we probably could go for another 2.5 hours. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, giving us so much time. I really appreciate that, and really educating us so much on so many different aspects of the Australian UFO scene. I'm sure that this is going to be a must-hear episode for any serious student of the UFO phenomenon on the global perspective, because they're going to learn so much about what was going on down under with regards to UFOs all these years. And we can thank you for that information. So thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for enlightening us to this fascinating history of ufology in Australia.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
That does it for this week's edition of BOA Audio Season 3. I can't thank Bill Chalker enough for appearing on the show and giving us so much time and working around the big time zone differences between Boston and Australia. He was a real pleasure to work with and someone I'm looking forward to speaking with again sometime in the future. You can find out more on Bill Chalker at the following websites: www.theozfiles.com and ozfiles.blogspot.com. Moving right along now, my voice is really failing me here, so we're going to skip over listener feedback this week. We'll bring it back next week, I promise. Hopefully my voice will be 100% by then. If you would like to be a part of BOA Audio listener feedback, there's 3 ways to go about doing it. Either A, go to binnallofamerica.com and click the contact button. B, simply write to boaaudio@hotmail.com. Or C, join the BOA forum at theusofe.com, theusofe.com. A, B, or C, either one of those avenues provides you with the means to get in touch with me and have your correspondence featured on BOA Audio listener feedback. Up next, of course, the thanks portion of the show. Big, super huge thanks to the outstanding BOA staff: Leslie, Chiron, Arlie, Joe V, Tina Senna, Rochelle Hawks, and Richard Thomas of Wales. Monday through Friday, tremendous esoteric observations from the BOA staff only at binnallofamerica.com. Without them, we would just be a podcast. With them, we are a multifaceted, multi-voiced outlet of esoteric opinion. As we say week in and week out here at the end of the program, if you're just listening to BOA Audio and you're not reading the columns at binnallofamerica.com, you're only getting half the story. Check out BOA and make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. My voice is really killing me right now, so we're just going to do a quick shout out here and ask for your donations. The season is winding down. You've heard just now a 2-hour plus phone call to Australia. It is our 5th international guest over the course of the season, and I think in total those episodes probably come near 10 hours altogether at least. And these bills add up, and the bills are paid for by yours truly, with help from great BOA Audio listeners who make donations. How can you make a donation? That's simple. You go to binnallofamerica.com or the BOA Audio archive page, and you click the golden PayPal button. That'll take you to PayPal. They'll walk you through the donation process. No donation is too small, and all donations go towards keeping BOA Audio and binnallofamerica.com up and running and freely available for all of our great listeners and readers the world over. Next week on the program, we're going to go off the beaten esoteric path as we'll examine the world of supervolcanoes and calderas with Marie Jones. Many of you may recall Marie from her appearance on BOA Audio Season 2 when we discussed her book, Science, P-S-I-E-N-C-E. This year we're going to be talking about her new book, which she co-authored with her father, titled Supervolcano. Marie's going to give us a sweeping overview of what calderas are and where they can be found, the infamous Toba eruption of 75,000 years ago, the Yellowstone caldera that has many in esoterica buzzing, and which area poses the most danger should a supervolcano erupt. We'll also be wargaming a caldera eruption to find out how extensive the damage would be and how, if at all, people can prepare for such an event. In addition to all that, we're going to have some bonus discussion on women in esoterica and the rise of the ghost hunting fad. It's an informative and informal edition of BOA Audio with one of the fastest rising and most respected researchers in the paranormal world today, Marie Jones. Stop on by BOA towards the end of next week for a preview on that, and come on back next weekend to pick up the MP3's streaming audio and podcast feed for Marie Jones talking about supervolcanoes on BOA Audio. And on that note, we're going to call it a week here. Luckily, I made it through. I didn't lose my voice entirely, but it's pretty worn out and roughed up, so I apologize for that, and thank you for your patience here, folks. Luckily, we've managed to get the episode out pretty early for you this weekend. I hope you're all having an outstanding Memorial Day weekend. Until next time, this is Tim Binnall, thanking you for listening and signing off.